Okay, well,
Hi.
I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Vera, who is a colleague of mine at Washington State University, assistant professor. And she's here to present on foundational concepts of Indigenous or planetary health from Indigenous perspective. And let's see, her bio. She's an assistant professor at Washington State University's College of Nursing and the Elon South Floyd College of Medicine. She's an Indigenous scholar who focuses on the intersections of Indigenous health, climate change, and land-based healing. And so Dr. Vera also practiced as a registered nurse for 4 years in the hospital and clinic setting, while also working as a medical writer and editor. She earned her BA in English and Creative Writing from Seattle University, her BSN from Boise State, and her PhD in nursing science from the University of Washington. So I am so excited to hear from you today. And if you want to go ahead and take it from here.
Yeah. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to have even some people on this call. This is great, and I'm sure the recording hopefully can reach even more people. My name is Melissa Vera. My Tsimshian name is Goipalakdao, which is Sun on the Frost. I am from the Wolf Clan, and I'm from the Tsimshian and Yaqui First Nations, and so that's Southeast Alaska and New Mexico, respectively. So that's kind of where I come from and why I care about, Indigenous health perspectives on planetary health. And so for the talk today, I'm going to give you kind of this foundational piece that I was able to do during my PhD program. It kind of set the stage for me philosophically, theoretically, all the reasons why I do what I do. And then after that, I can actually show you what Indigenous research kind of looks like in the wild. I have video for an event, a kind of a data collection event that I did in New Zealand just this last month. So yay. So I always love to do the land acknowledgement, but for me, it's not just the thing I check off the box. I am on Duwamish lands, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, and these are all of my Indigenous brothers and sisters. And I think that we all very much share a collective history and enduring lots of different things. And, we have this amazing resilience in tribal community. And without them, without me, without our history, I wouldn't be here. I always love to acknowledge that. And I always acknowledge Mother Earth and all of my more than human kin. Okay, so the background. So people in nursing, especially, were uniquely positioned to influence planetary health. We have power in numbers, power in the trust the public holds in us. We have this holistic worldview, and we have an actual influence on public opinion and public policy, health policy. But a lot of efforts to combat climate change are still business as usual, even in climate change research spaces. So Indigenous knowledge keepers are essential to place front and center in these spaces, in my opinion, so we can decolonize these ideas of science and decolonize academy and research. And the way we could do that is intentional collaborations between Indigenous knowledge keepers and non-Indigenous allies, which we think could revolutionize how we all think of, research, and teach about planetary health. So historically, Indigenous focused content and knowledge has been overlooked in climate discourses and assessment reports. So in the past decade, there's definitely been this increasing recognition, but it's kind of more symbolic rather than meaningful, because it's not really been practically applied. And in a lot of spaces I'm in, I see that people are kind of trying to take traditional knowledge of Indigenous folks and just kind of take little smatterings of it and just put it next to Western science, but that's really not how it should go. It should be more of it can't be merged. It should be more of a uplifting of centering of Indigenous voices. Because Indigenous communities, especially in the Arctic and coastal areas, are hit first and worst by the effects of climate change. So me and a cohort of people. We're all Indigenous scholars and knowledge keepers, elders. We wanted to create a new framework of planetary health, the determinants of planetary health, and what does that even mean? So it could better inform research, policy, and on the ground efforts. So the coolest part about it actually was me being able to partake as a PhD student in my first Indigenous methodologically based study. And it was definitely the coolest thing I experienced during my PhD project. We had Indigenous leaders, scholars, health practitioners, Mother Earth warriors from all over the world. We got together on Zoom for 3 different phases because we wanted to conceptualize the determinants of well-being for Mother Earth and what does that even look like. We came from the US, Canada, Australia, Germany, Kenya, Bolivia, and El Salvador. We even had one of our elders zooming in from the Amazon rainforest, and that was really, really amazing. We opened the Zoom call with prayer, ceremony. We used research as ceremony. And that looks very different than any other Western science that I was ever involved in prior to that. We had our elders pray, and that one elder from the Amazon, he like held up his computer so he can listen to the evening bird song, just so we could really kind of connect with each other and with Mother Earth for the important work that we were doing. And so we really, we use this deep listening method is what it's called, which was a way for us to like learn and work together that was informed by Indigenous conceptions of community and reciprocity. So we identified 10 main determinants of planetary health, and they fall under these 3 levels. And we acknowledge now that like the main determinants were identified across like a bunch of people throughout the world on this call, but it also doesn't actually necessarily capture every single it doesn't capture every single determinant that could be, more particular to a different community. So I just acknowledge that. The first determinant we found was ancestral legal personhood designation. Indigenous peoples globally have the sacred mandate and right to give voice to rivers and to all of nature. This right is usually not respected by common law. However, Indigenous peoples continue to stand up and do these massive acts of protection for Mother Earth. So there have been some approaches that extend this legal pluralism that illuminates this interconnection that we all have with Mother Earth. And they are in New Zealand and in Australia. So in New Zealand, Whanganui River Claim Settlement gave legal personhood to the Whanganui River. And then the Protection Act of 2017 legally recognizes the Yarra River as a living entity in Australia. So both rivers are a source of ideas and inspirations from ancestral personhood and existence with earth laws. And it kind of set the stage for this like extension of legal personhood into ancestral beings. Essentially what this kind of calls forth in these like climate change research spaces is just that it's just kind of a counter decolonized narrative to what we usually have going on, which is capitalist, colonialist mandates about the environment and that don't really take into account the environmental crisis that we're in. And so this is a narrative that kind of gives voice and protection and identity to these non-living ancestors of ours. Respect of the feminine was a really big one. Women in a lot of Indigenous nations, and not even necessarily just Indigenous nations, women are keepers of cultural identity. They're caretakers of the natural environment. The Indigenous worldviews more collectively usually recognize Mother Earth and her like creative power as like our primordial first mother. These creation stories, they tend to actually uplift the feminine, and it gives the feminine the principal role of creation, order, regeneration of the world. It bonds people, place, and community. Women are vessels for strong communities and networks. They foster community. They strengthen resilience and enhance collective vitality and well-being. And we are all nourished by Mother Earth. And unfortunately, these global realities are far from acknowledging the cultural, spiritual and leadership role of women in the feminine embodied gender expressions. Women and feminine genders are continually discriminated against in our patriarchal, political, economic, racial, gender oppressive systems. And they don't really recognize that feminine regenerative power necessary to shift how we interact with Mother Earth. So, like, violence against Mother Earth is violence against women, and vice versa. And so, we were basically calling for like a development of this idea about respecting the feminine, because that collectively would really shift how we treat the earth. And that is obviously a really important determinant of having a healthy Mother Earth. It's how you look at women. This was one of the bigger ones we found in the interconnectedness level. We talked about how our planet's destruction is really based on this like wounding of, or like separation from our actual own connectedness within this circle of life, right? We've lost our identity in this, in how we live sustainably with Mother Earth. We look at the ecological demise that points to this impaired human relationship with ourselves and with nature. Humans are nature, nature is us. And so, in a broader sense, there's this loss of ecologically bound cultural identity. It's this disconnect from nature. It manifests as fragmented and dissociated identity that can't recognize itself as part of the system, making it easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. So it's like this ideology of independence is really destroying the interdependence that we should have. It increases this entitled ownership of resources to where we can extract and perpetuate planetary harm. So actually nourishing that connection and reconnecting to what we used to be like within Mother Earth and within the ecosystems is a huge determinant of planetary health for all of us. And so this one was about how Indigenous nations just predominantly are collective by nature. So it's like this collective-based society that's not individualistic. It kind of ties into the first one, the one I was just talking about on the previous slide. But if you're in this collective nature, you think about generations behind you. You talk to your ancestors about your decisions now and how they impact generations ahead of you. And it's out there in the zeitgeist of, the 7 generations. It's even like an organic brand that came from Indigenous community, where you think of 7 generations ahead. And this is kind of the same world. We'll get more into it too, with like the scientific paradigm, where it's like in these research spaces we're always asked, like, what's your 5-year plan? Or what do you like, how are you going to impact with your research now? And in Indigenous communities, we think about like the 125-year plan. I'm like, what are we doing now to further this thing that we want to do to nourish Mother Earth? How are we going to take care of generations ahead of us? And so having this worldview actually maintains balance and well-being for everybody and for Mother Earth. So the scientific paradigm, Western science, as we all know, because we're all Western scientists, I think we're all pretty trained. It's like to theorize, hypothesize, and measure, find variables, but Indigenous science is not like that. And being able to meld the two is really nice. They're in these spaces, people talk a lot about two-eyed seeing, where you take like this Western science approach and you see that through this, you can see like climate change research through this eye with Western science, this eye with Indigenous research methods or ways of knowing. And I'm always like, no, climate change research, we need like 2 Indigenous eyeballs and like a pinky of Western science. I don't think that they're like, the antithesis of each other. But when we're talking about planetary health and the crisis that we're in and what Indigenous knowledge has to offer, I'm always like really vocal about that. And hopefully I'm not offending anybody on this call, but we have these underappreciated things within Indigenous science. And we talk about these first law things where it's like systems oriented, it's ecologically based networks. everybody's in this network. We're all together, we're all connected. And it's really complex when you add it in to a really complex thing like planetary health or climate change. And so it all kind of fits. And it's contextual, holistic, symbolic, lots of metaphor and connection. It's non-linear, and we're not like bound by linear concepts of time, even especially in certain indigenous cultures. And so we use this collective observation of our people to explain natural phenomena and explain Mother Earth. And we can't solve the same problems with the things that created them, is essentially the biggest takeaway on this slide. So governance and law, this is kind of a more obvious one. Like the governments and law is like our explicit and implicit agreements within society on how we behave and how we act. But within like the way it is now, we do have a lot of laws that don't really take into account interaction with Mother Nature. It's more based on GDP, resources, how to extract these for our benefit and growth, and that kind of mindset. But it's at the expense of Mother Earth, and really at the expense of all of us. And so with Indigenous First Law, we talk about reciprocity, responsibility, love. It prioritizes the rights of all beings on the earth. So it kind of keeps that like uber independent worldview in check. And it's better for the planetary health that way. So 80% of the biodiversity left on the planet today is stewarded by Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous people only make up 5% of the population. And so this kind of ties into other ones that I'll talk about, but having your land tenure rights, like your actual right to this like ancestral land, those are constantly in flux right now in the world today. People being moved off their land for corporate reasons, oil, things like that. But if you keep moving Indigenous people off their land or they cannot take care of that land, it is not going to be good for any of us. We need to continue to like hold precious this rest of the biodiversity that's left and actually increase that biodiversity. So taking Indigenous people from their land is not going to create that reality for us. In Indigenous languages, we talked about in our call how Indigenous languages, they're really extensive and complex. They usually kind of emphasize verbs rather than nouns, like a being of, and it holds these ecological knowledges that have been developed over millennia. So every time a language is lost, you lose a ton of ecological knowledge. And science is science when you look at these Indigenous peoples that have been in like one specific part of the land, for example, for millennia. And what does that, like, what kind of knowledge do those people hold? So much knowledge about how that system works and how humans interact in that system for a beneficial way. Like humans are not like a scourge on the earth. They don't have to be, at least. And these ecological knowledge held within these languages are kind of key to keeping the health of the planet going. Oh, and it's kind of how we talk about things too. Indigenous people, they usually have actual names for things, names for a mountain, names for a river. It's the way you speak about something. If you talk about a river as your relative with an actual name, as your auntie, as your grandmother mountain, this and that, like it's harder for you to do something really awful that would take out of that land or extract from the land in a non-sustainable way. So this one is a kind of obvious as well. Like if Indigenous people are healthy, those people that steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, then the earth is healthier. If Indigenous people aren't healthy and they're not able to be uplifted in narratives, not able to literally get out of bed and take care of Mother Earth the way that we have always been taking care of Mother Earth, it's not good for any of us. And having that land, that culture, that sovereignty over that land, if all those aspects are thriving, then that is well-being. And so with that well-being of Indigenous people, everybody benefits, especially Mother Earth. And this last one was my favorite one. It was all about Indigenous, like the role of Indigenous elders and Indigenous children. So a lot of Indigenous culture, there's like an intergenerational household, and these extend beyond the physical and social environments in which a person lives. So home is conceived as like the relationship that connects a person to all that surrounds them, including their family members, other people in the community, and all the other beings within that community. People, plants, animals, insects, and land are ancestors. They hold our stories, they hold our languages, and the elders hold our songs and our traditions. And then they're able to pass that along to the children. And so it kind of goes back to that 7 generations thing, like how do you pass on this information further, and further down the line? It's that intergenerational household. It's that honoring and knowledge and acknowledging of the sacredness of elders and the sacredness of children, so they can kind of go forward. So the conclusions are that Indigenous people offer really important lessons through cultivating an intentional, inclusive, and interactive perspective. We're based on observation and relationships with land. And when I say land, it's like capital L land. These observations are like our direct vessels to understanding and relating to these two living beings, which is ourself and Mother Earth. And all people need to acknowledge and understand and appreciate what Indigenous people have to offer in this space. Because as we become like in more equitable, inclusive societies, institutions, we need to embrace that diverse knowledge. It's going to get us closer to well-being for all of us and well-being for the planet. So these are my amazing co-authors. Check them out. Nicole Redvers is really well known. She talks to the UN all the time. Yuria, I'd like to shout out to her. She has a book coming out in November. You can look up her name, and she has a website, and she is one of the most phenomenal scholars I've ever met. And she has a book coming out that's gonna be really good. These are all the places and spaces and lands we come from. A lot of them. And then Toyaksit Nutsum is thank you in Tsimshian language. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I can stop sharing at least for now and just see if anyone has any questions.
Thanks so much for this excellent presentation on Indigenous science and medicine as a path forward for planetary health. And just thank you for being a leader in this international movement and bringing it to nursing. So before we can pause, I know we wanted to pause the recording too, but I wondered if you wanted to share a little bit about how you're applying this to your own research.
Oh yeah, because I didn't want to like barrel straight into that, but we can.
Oh, okay.
Pause too, and
I wanted to keep the recording on too for that piece as well. So
let's do that. So if anyone has questions, hold for a few seconds, and then let's look at some videos.
Perfect.
Thanks. No problem. And I'll show you. What am I going to even show you? I know. Okay, so I'll show you just a part of this because it's a longer clip, but essentially I've been working with Maori women and talking about how they are physically embodied on the land, their lands that they hold dear to them, and how does that make them feel? How does that heal them? And how do they heal the land in like this reciprocal back and forth relationship? And we had a grant for that, and it came from the University of New Zealand and NAPI, which is a Maori research center, and they enabled us to buy drones and research recording equipment and all sorts of cool stuff. So we were able to do some of these. This I'll show you first is like the drone footage of somebody talking about their lands, and then we actually had like a data collection event, I guess you'd call it, where we essentially had like an art exhibit of everything based on this stuff. And this was like projected right on the wall. And then all the Indigenous women that were invited were walking around these poles with the different artwork that was created based on the metaphors, based on the research, asking questions about like, what does this mean to you? and women filled out Post-it notes. And then we also had a wananga, which is essentially like a focus group discussion, but like indigenously for 2.5 hours after everybody kind of walked around and did like Post-it notes and stuff. So we got even further information on that. But let me fast forward to like a really cool one too. See if I can find it.
It's still space to restore it to grow,
Sorry, making you guys like dizzy. Okay. So this is Hendakura is next. She's really, really amazing. She's a traditional weaver.
I wonder if when you share it, you can optimize for sharing because the sound is a little broken up. And when you share, there's like the optimize for video sharing.
Let me figure that out. Yeah. Optimize for media player. No. That's the one. Oh, that's not the one. But actually I can show this to you. This is part of what we had in the actual like art session. These were like pictorial descriptions. I mean, it doesn't have any sound or anything. And so we had 5 different metaphors, and these were the artistic expressions of that metaphor. And then we had somebody who was really into video editing that made them move. And then we projected these onto the Poe and the wall and had women looking at them and having them respond to the questions. And the Maori have a word for land, which is whenua, which is the same word for placenta, which is really interesting. Very connected. Yeah. So then those were just all projected. And I can find the other video. I don't know if you'll be able to see this or if I need to like reshare. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. This is the actual event. Right. And I can actually share that other video later if you guys are interested, but I just didn't want to mess too much with like our time. But it was just essentially like interviewing people on the land, and we had this like a drone and we could kind of span out over what lands they're even talking about, and they just talked about the importance of the land and or whatever activity they did on that land and how it affected them and their health and how they felt about the health of the planet and how they gave back to healing the land and themselves. And yeah, So I mean, it's like a baby stages right now. I think we had 5 of those interviews, and this is our first event, and we're going to have another one in November when I go back to New Zealand. And yeah, so hopefully we'll get more and more stories and amazing women involved. Yeah.
That is just beautiful. I'm really excited for your emerging research, and I love the incorporation of art in there. So thank you so much for sharing, and we're excited to learn more. Should we stop the recording now, and then we'll move on to discuss?